I had one of those vehicles that was the envy of every man. It was a 1978 butter yellow Volkswagen Jetta. Came equipped with rust. If you move the floor mat, you could see down to the floor. And Jamie and I were first married and needed a vehicle and purchased that for just a little over $1,000. And it had a unique twist. Not only was it beautiful, it ran on diesel. And of course, something that runs on diesel in 1978, when I first was looking at it and kind of processed that, I thought, man, this isn't good. But believe it or not, that thing got 50 miles to the gallon. And I didn't do much driving back in those days, especially when we first bought it. I was just traveling around Springfield, Missouri occasionally. And so I wouldn't have to fuel it up. And so for the first time in my life, and I'm embarrassed to say multiple times, I ran out of fuel. Because when you only put fuel in something every month, right, you forget that it's needed. And of course, I would realize in those moments how finite resources are, how limited resources are when I was walking, right, to go find some fuel. But God is different than man. He has these qualities that make him God. He is eternal. He is without beginning or end. He's right? Omniscient. He's everywhere. He knows everything. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. God is different than we are. And these miracle stories that we read about in the Old Testament, where people had run out of flour or oil, and they were in a moment of desperation and didn't know what to do, the miraculous happened, and even though there was a limited amount of oil in the jar, as the widow poured the oil, it kept on flowing, and it kept on flowing, and it kept on flowing. And we find from these qualities of God and these divine moments when God intervenes that God is limitless, that his resources are without end. And so we're going to talk about love and grace and hope over the next 3 weeks. Today, we're going to talk about love. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 3 today. The Apostle Paul so eloquently gives us an understanding of God's love in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14. It says, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. And I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and how high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God." God's love is limitless. The Apostle Paul is compelled to find his knees to pray that God's people would begin to grasp how limitless God's love really is. In fact, this phrase, "so that you may have power to grasp," and then he goes on to talk about love. See, there's a power at work, dark forces that want us to think that God's love is limited. There's this power at work in our own human nature and self-doubt. Oftentimes the lies of the enemy stir this up, and that power's at work to make sure that we believe the lie that God's love is limited. And whatever source of love that was extended to us at one time is no longer available to us today like it once was, because we've done something to disqualify ourselves from receiving His love. This is a lie from the pit of hell. God's love is limitless. The Apostle Paul says this in pondering and trying to grasp this love: how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. What an eloquent way to say you cannot measure God's love. You can't put it on a scale. You can't get out a tape measure, because as you ponder the width of it and the depth of it and the height of it and how long it is, you'd get lost in an endless ocean of God's love. I think of the mystery of space, the universe, that the universe is ever expanding, that as far as we know, it doesn't have boundaries, but it continues to push into the void, so we get a glimpse into God's limitless qualities in nature. So is true of God's love. But doesn't God know how awful and how foolish and how repetitive and how willful our sin is? Doesn't God know that although we strive to be good and good neighbors, there's moments in life where we do things that surprise even ourselves? They seem heinous, they seem evil, they seem wicked. It's not just that you've missed the mark. There's moments where you just feel so awful by the way you're living your life and the way you're treating other people. And how foolish, although you've been there and done that and known that and surfed that wave and experienced the shame and guilt and pain and heartache and fallout and consequences of sin. Doesn't God know how foolish we are? I'm an idiot. I've done it again. Here I am. Why would God give us the time of day? How repetitive, this endless cycle. It never ends. We keep doing the same things over and over again. That's madness. It's insanity. An addiction we can't escape. And then just how willful. Oh, that we would be on this journey and experience the love of God and His extension of grace day after day. And experience His limitless love. And yet in the midst of His blessing and favor, we're like the toddler who's 2 or 3 years old, and their mother says, "Don't do that." And mother says, "Don't do that again." And then you watch that little toddler look defiantly in his mother's eyes and very slowly reach out his hand and do it again. That willful sin that exists. And when we consider the depth of our sin and how at times it seems like we cannot measure it, we question, can God really love us? Friends, when we go toe-to-toe with God, we lose every time. God's love is greater than your sin. You can't mess up the love of God. You cannot disqualify yourself from the love of God. You cannot escape the love of God. The love of God transcends your very being, your every thought. The actions that you did in the past and the actions that you'll do in the future, God's love is limitless. And He chooses to use His love on you. But just because he has endless resource, it doesn't mean it's cheap. God's a good steward of everything he has. Church, love is expensive. But God's already counted the cost. See, it's expensive because it makes him seem foolish to give love out again to someone who's blown it time and time again. Why would God put his reputation on the line? Why would God, in his infinite wisdom and sovereignty and holiness, why would a holy God continue to extend love to sinful man? It cost him something. It cost him his son, Jesus. He was willing to pay the price so that we could experience his love and forgiveness. And yet he chose to do it anyway. I want to read from the Apostle Paul. He said it so clearly when talking about becoming a disciple of Christ. Verse 27, he says, "And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." He's making the case that there's a cost, and it says this: "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it?" And if God would ask us to consider the cost of what it takes to follow him, surely we can believe that he already counted the cost when it came to loving me. He's counted the cost, and he's done it anyway. In fact, the sin that we so quickly engage in, the awful, foolish, repetitive, willful sin, it actually in itself became the path that God used to extend his love to us. Because Jesus, right? The story of Jesus and his crucifixion is awful. It's foolish. And yet, God uses the very rejection of his son Jesus as the vehicle by which we experience his love. And so when we think that we can opt out of God's love and say, I haven't earned the right to be loved by God, that very rejection is all what Jesus experienced when he went to the cross. See, God counted the cost, and he loved us in the midst of that rejection. He's loving you in the midst of your rejection of him, church. And it's his joy. It's his delight. He loves doing it. He's compelled to continue to extend his love and his favor. I'm so thankful today that God is not like man. It's a divine maturity. He's willing to deal with our immaturities, willing to take on the hassle of our nonsense. He loves you today. He loves you today. His love is limitless for you today. And nothing is going to make that change. There was a woman in history who was compelled to share that love. Her name's Jarena Lee. And in 18 19, she was the first African American woman to be ordained by the AME Church. In 1819, a black woman was given the right to preach by a white minister. And as much as she had that seal of approval, Jarena, as you can imagine, was often rejected because of who she was. And yet, it says that she heard the word of God. It compelled her. It stirred her to keep going on. And there's an account in history that she would walk thousands of miles to declare God's love, to preach His word to other people. By foot. That in 1 year she walked some 2,300 something miles and preached nearly 200 sermons to share the message that God loves you. And yet, she often experienced rejection. And in the face of that rejection, Jarena pushed on. God pushes on. God's compelled to show His love for you. I love my wife, Jamie, very much. It's just an honor to be married to her. We have a really great marriage. It's not perfect, but one of the things that we like to tell each other is, I like you. Because sometimes love is this big idea that seems to communicate a generality, right? In the sense of, I love you, it's unconditional, I'm dealing with you, right? But it's something else to like someone. It means I like spending time with you. I like hearing your voice. I like dreaming with you. I want to be in the same space as you. God likes you. He doesn't just love you. He doesn't just use His limitless quality, this divine love. He likes you. Why does He forgive us day after day? Why does He lavish us with love when we don't deserve it? Because He likes you. He wants to spend time with you. He wants to be with you. He wants nothing to separate you from His presence. Can I invite you to be loved by God today? Can I share with you that He likes you and He wants to be with you and that His love is limitless? John chapter 15, we get this great verse from Jesus. Before His crucifixion, He says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Do you hear it? I like you. You're my friend. Sure, I'm the Son of God, and I'm going to be seated at the right hand of the Father, and I'm in all things and through all things, and I hold all things together, and I'm the firstborn of all creation and the first to be resurrected from the dead, and I'm your Lord, I'm your King, I'm your Master, but I'm your friend. I like you. I love you. And I'm going to lay down my life for you. That's what Jesus did.